Okay, sorry. Okay. Anyway, moving on. 1 Peter, right? Time for a sermon. All right, good. We're carrying on in our sermon series in 1 Peter. And Peter is all about how do we live our lives in the world as Christians, being sort of distinctly different. We're kind of like exiles. We're a bit like foreigners. We're a bit like strangers in the world. Not because we don't like physically live here, but because our beliefs, what we sort of believe to be true about the world, our values, what we think is happening in the world is a bit different than the rest of the world around us. And so our values, our ethics, our morals, what we think is good and not good, what we think is helpful and unhelpful, is going to be slightly different. Just like I messed up and I used the word pool, like in America, it's just not quite as rude. It's still a bit rude, but it's not quite as rude, evidently, as it is here. Right? So we sometimes make some mistakes along the way, right, when we're foreigners, aliens, strangers, but that's kind of how we are. We're different from the world around us. And one of our main differences is we believe in the resurrection of the body. We just said that when we opened the service in the creed. That just like Jesus died on the cross and was risen again from the dead bodily, the same Spirit that conceived his body in the Virgin Mary's womb, the same Spirit that raised his body from the dead is given to us through faith in him, and that same Spirit will raise us from the dead one day as well, even if we've been cremated or eaten by sharks, I keep saying. I'm trying to think of what's the weirdest, most difficult way to think of resurrecting a body. Those would probably be two of them, right? And so we have a hope. This life in the body isn't the only life in the body that we have. And so we can invest it. I think many times, and in these three terms about just stuff in general, there's waste, expense, and investment, right? I can waste my money, for instance. And I can waste my money by spending it on something that isn't even worth the money I spent on it or will depreciate in value, right? So if I spend, I don't know, I get ripped off and I spend, 50 quid on something from Temu and it comes and it's actually worth 5. That was a way that breaks in 24 hours, right? That was a waste of money. I could expend, just an expense. I could spend money and get sort of like for like. It's a fair price for a quality product. I spend the amount of money, whatever it is, and the product I get is worth that. The good or the service that I get is worth it. Or I could even put it into a savings account. I could spend my money by putting it into a savings account. It's not really an investment because, I'm not really going to gain interest on it, but it's just like at some point in time, I can pull the same amount of money back out. It's an expense, like for like. And then there's investment. And if I were to invest my money, I would spend it on something that will yield a return. So I might spend it on a property, right? And that property, Lord willing, increases in value, and then I can sell the property, and I've made money off of it. Or I could put it into an ISO or some sort of an index fund, right? And it'll gain interest, and I will get a return, right? I'll have more money as a result of having invested that money, right? So waste, expense, or investment. And the same thing with this life. We can waste this life and get a worse return on whatever we do in the body. However we live our lives, whatever choices we make, we could waste our life by, at the end of it, getting a worse return for all of that expenditure. We might think, I'm hoping for a like for like. That, it kind of all comes out in the wash, and what I do in the body, I kind of break even somehow or another. Or there's a sense of investment. I can invest this life with a confident expectation of a greater return resulting from that investment. Now, the reality is when it comes to our life, there's really only two options. We either waste it or we invest it. There is no just like-for-like expense. We either spend our life in a certain way and get a worse return for it, or we live our life in another way and get a better return for it. So Peter's trying to indicate and trying to communicate to his readers, this is how we invest our life. This is how we live our life today, being confident of a greater return in the future. Right? This is how we live our lives. And there's kind of things like putting away malice and envy and wrath and gossip and lying and junk like that. And putting on things like holiness, encouragement, honoring people. So now we have these three relationships that Peter is addressing with his readers. And they're basically the three relationships of any human society. You have family, and then families do things like grow crops or herd sheep or do some kind of something economically. And then they trade with other families. And there's commerce. And they might employ people. There's an economic component to human societies where we're doing business with each other. And people are hired and people are fired and people work for other people. And then there's government. We kind of then say we need to organize ourselves so that commerce happens fairly. We need to organize ourselves so if they want to come and steal our sheep, we can keep them from stealing our sheep. We're going to organize ourselves with government. And so these three sort of basic building blocks of human society, Peter is going to be talking to his audience and writing to his audience about how do we as Christians interact with those three levels. Now, one of the criticisms that often gets levied against these texts that we've been reading, and I'll read the next text in a moment, is really, it's a critique that came up really in the sort of late 19th and into the 20th century. Sort of Karl Marx is one of the guys who really espoused this, and that is religion was an instrument used to oppress people, to keep poor people poor and concentrate resource and power among the landowners and those who owned private property. Right? And during European Christendom, which is that time of European history where the church and state were so deeply intertwined that the church was kind of ruling things and governing things and arguably was pretty corrupt in the way it did so, we can understand where that criticism comes from. But we read in 1 Peter chapter 2, we talked about it last week, Peter writes, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people." Hey, just a side note over here. Have you ever been around somebody who's like, "I just want to know what God's will is so I can do it"? What's God's will? I just want to know. What shoes should I wear today? Does God have a view on which shoes I should wear? Maybe he has a certain plan based on the shoes I'm going to wear. If I choose to wear flip-flops, I'm probably not running. Okay, what's God's will? Well, great that we want to discern God's will about any and everything, but let's be really clear about where God's will has been made really clear to us. Well, God's will for you is that by doing good, you silence the foolish talk of ignorant people. There you go, that's God's will. Go do that. Sound good? Hooray. All right, that's a side note. Anyhow, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. And so there's this sense where Peter is encouraging, in fact, commanding his readers, listen, be subject to institutional authority. We talked last week about the difference between obedience and submission. Sometimes we have to be disobedient because the institutional authority is expecting us to do something that our faith in Christ and our obedience to Christ won't allow us to, in which case then we're submissive to the consequence. Right? Now, where Marx's criticism is like, oh, the church used that and the state used that in order to oppress people and say it's God's will that you obey us. Those who were doing that sort of thing really misunderstood what this passage is really all about. There's a book called Jesus and the Subversion of Violence. Interesting book, but it's and we're going to get to it in the next part of our text where we see how Jesus interacts with injustice and violence upon him. And that serves as a model for us. And we'll get to why here in just a moment. So now we're going to move from governmental stuff, which we talked about last week. I don't want to rehearse too much, and move on to economic stuff. Verse 18, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. So there's this phenomenon, and we're not unfamiliar with it, where in an economic environment you've got servants and masters. We don't have that so much in our culture, in our society. However, there are more slaves today than there ever have been. Interesting. Very interesting. But nevertheless, there's this dynamic of servant, master, or you might say employer, employee in our context. Right? Or hirer and contractor. That kind of a thing. And a vexing teaching here in Peter is servants, employees, when your master or your employer treats you badly, endure it. How do we think and feel about that? I'll be honest, I've got really mixed feelings about it. You know? Now, in our context, we have sort of free employment, right? We can quit and probably find another job. Might take us a little while, but by and large, we can quit, we can find another job. If we can't find another job and we're stuck, we can at least fall back on universal credit, NHS, we're good. Life is going to be all right. We're going to make it. There's going to be food on our table. There's going to be a roof over our head. We're going to have medical treatment. We might wish it was nicer. We might wish it was better, but we'll at least have it. Right? And so we have the ability to opt out of what we could call abusive relationships economically. And I would argue probably should opt out of economically abusive relationships. Any abusive relationship, really. We have the freedom to opt out of those. Now, someone in this context doesn't quite have that same option. They don't quite have that same option. They're a bit more stuck in the first century Roman Empire than you or I would be. And so Peter has this teaching, like it's quite radical. Listen, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only the good and gentle, but also the unjust. For this is a gracious thing. A gracious thing. You've heard me talk about grace and mercy. Grace is when a good thing is given to someone who doesn't deserve it. Mercy is when a negative thing is withheld from someone who does deserve it. And justice is when you get the good thing you deserve and the bad thing you deserve because you deserve it. That's justice. Right? Are we all clear on that? Justice is when you get exactly what you deserve. You get the good things you deserve, you get the bad things you deserve. Justice. Mercy is when you don't receive the bad thing that you do deserve. And grace is when you receive a good thing that you don't deserve. Right? What does the Lord require? We talked about back in Micah, but to do justice, right? That's the norm. You get the good thing you deserve, you get the bad thing you deserve. That's the norm. Do justice. Love mercy. And walk humbly. Love the practice of withholding the negative thing that somebody else definitely deserves. There's something very godly about that. Indeed, there's something very gracious here that's being talked about here because the servant doesn't really have the ability to give the negative thing that their unjust master might deserve. Mercy isn't really an option for the servant, but grace is. To continue to do a good thing for someone who doesn't deserve it, that's a gracious thing. And it's not only that there's somebody who's just a bit of a jerk, and so I'm not going to give them a good thing. They're a jerk specifically to you. And you're giving a good thing back. This is a gracious thing. And he goes on. Listen, if you're bad, you do dumb stuff, and you get in trouble, and you endure the consequence, it's no credit to you. But if you're doing well, and you suffer unjustly, that's a gracious thing. So, when we think about your job, right? Some of us have more freedom as it relates to our jobs than others. Some of us, we got a job, we're stuck with, that's the one. That is the one. And we need to rock that baby, because there isn't anything else. And no matter how much you don't like it, it's better than universal credit. And so you're gonna roll with it. Keep doing an awesome job. Keep doing an awesome job. Your boss is a jerk. Treats you badly. Yanks you around. Schedules you when he said he wouldn't. Underpays you when she said she would pay you properly. Whatever it happens to be. Keep doing an awesome job. Why? Well, we have this example of Christ. Verse 21. Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree. That's a euphemism for the cross. So, Jesus' suffering on the cross was due to me and to you. Right? We are responsible for his mistreatment. Our sin is responsible, shares responsibility for his mistreatment. And yet, he received it and has given us grace. He's given us a good thing that we don't deserve. He's withheld the bad thing that we do deserve in mercy. And in that way, he settled his own justice. Right? How many of you, just quick showing of hands, not to embarrass anyone, I think I know the result. How many of you would like Jesus to do something good for you? Right? How many of you are pretty sure that Jesus has a good reason to not give something good to you? So what do we want? At the end of the day, what we want is for Jesus to, though we have been bad, and though we are responsible in part for his crucifixion, to nevertheless give us good things. If that's what we want from Christ, then haven't we got to participate in a similar sort of thing if we're going to be like him? As we live life in this body, awaiting our resurrection, being confident of that, then, Christian, we should be a top employee. We should be a top provider for your client. We should be a top performer. That doesn't mean like, I'm the smartest in my class. You might not be smart, sorry. Like, some of us are smart, some of us aren't. Let's just be honest. Like, you know, I'm pretty smart when it comes to theology and Bible, but if you put a bunch of math in front of me, like, sorry, I'm pretty dumb when it comes to math. I genuinely am. It's shocking. It's right? Like, what I'm talking about being valuable is like you come and you bring your A game. Whatever your A game is, whatever your game is, you bring your A game every time. When you're in class, kids, you're at school, you show up and you show up to learn. You're there to be attentive. My teacher is a jerk. They're always shouting. They're always this. They're always that. They never let us out on time. Everyone complains about their teachers. Boring. Come on. Show up. Pay attention. Do your homework. Turn it in. When the teacher's talking, you be quiet. When you've got a question, raise your hand and wait to be called on. Be awesome. Be the kid that the teacher's like, I am so glad that kid is in my class. And I'm sure that teacher at some point in time is going to, hey, you, be quiet, sit down. And you're like, it wasn't me. It was too. I heard you. No, it was the guy next to me, I swear. And it was the guy next to you. And the teacher's yelling at you, thinking you're in trouble, and they give you a lunch detention. Just roll with it. And then keep being an awesome student. Just roll with it and keep being an awesome student. Give you a little example from my own life as a parent. You know, as a parent, every now and again, you're like, okay, I've got a bad habit. I've got a bad habit. And I'm working on it as a guy. Like when something of mine goes missing, 9 times out of 10, I just presume one of my nasty little kids took it. Right? It doesn't matter that they're like in their 20s now and they're not little. One of my nasty little kids, they're like, where's my chocolate? Where's my that? Where's that? And 9 times out of 10, I've just misplaced it and forgotten where I put it. Right? It's a bad habit. I'm working on it, guys. All right? One of the best things for my kids is to be like, sorry, Dad. And they know that now. I didn't take it. I'm like, oh, one of you are lying to me, you lying filthy maggots. I don't actually call them lying filthy maggots. Sometimes I do, don't I, Mary? We're talking about you again. It's always, no, I'm joking. No. I'm talking about my bad habit of when something of mine goes missing, my immediate reaction is to think that one of my kids took it. And I was saying, one of the things that I think you guys know now is you can be like, Dad, I didn't take it. And give me a little bit of time. And eventually I'll go, well, I mean, a lot and a little is relative depending on how many years you've lived, right? Like, yeah, yeah, right? And you kind of go, oh. And usually now I'm pretty good at coming back and be like, that was my bad. I misplaced it. I'm sorry. You know? That's the best thing that happens. If they're like, get all militant at me because I'm being a jerk, well, then it just accelerates, doesn't it? And once it accelerates and escalates, well, then it gets ridiculous. And it becomes absurd. And nothing healthy is happening. Right? Every now and again, even though I'm in the position of power and authority because I'm the head of the household, like I need my kids to just be like, all right. And then I have a responsibility to say sorry. I have a responsibility to show back up and be like, I was out of order. I was out of line. I'm sorry. And this is the basic teaching here. You might have a boss who's a jerk. You might have a teacher who's unkind and strict and mean. You might have a client or a provider or whatever in your life, and you're like, they just have it out. One of the things we do as Christians, out of our freedom, is we roll with it, and we keep being an awesome employee. We keep being an awesome student. We keep being an awesome provider. We keep being someone who the other is glad is around. It's a gracious thing, and it models the gospel because we have mistreated Jesus, and yet he has responded with grace. Right? And that's one of the ways that we live as a peculiar people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, as people belonging to God, as Christians in this world. Amen? All right, let's stand to sing as we prepare for our time of confession.